We're going to now look at a part B from theme 1E for Christianity, which is the early church in Acts of Apostles. You probably know this theme as kerygma. Kerygmata is just the plural of kerygma. Don't let that word throw you in the exam. And the main scholars are C.H. Dodd and Bultmann. And if we look at the evaluation points at the bottom here, there are two main ones that are listed. So whether the speeches have any historical value, that's the essay we're going to talk you through. And then whether the kerygmata within Acts have any value for Christians today. I'm just going to go quickly to the Eduqas Religious Studies website. Here it is here, okay. Then you click. If you scroll down, you can see this bar here that says specifications, SAMs and books and so on. You're going to click where it says specification and SAMs, which takes you to this document here where it says A-level religious studies SAMs. SAMs just stands for sample assessment material. And you come to this document here, which is the sample paper. So I'm showing it you like this so you know if you have clicked on the right thing. And so this is just the sample papers that we were given before we started to teach. So Lytchett students should have this in their folders. And there are exams for each religion, as well as philosophy and ethics. So here is the paper. And there are questions here on the World Council of Churches, liberation theology, kerygma, filioque, and ordination of women. And so there are mark schemes here for each of those questions. So as well as the grade boundaries, which is what the examiner uses to give your paper a grade, so we can see here, thorough, sustained and clear views. So that's why we have a thesis statement supported by evidence, a response that identifies and thoroughly addresses the issues raised by the question. That's why we keep linking back to the title. Views of scholars, schools of thought are used. That's what I'm going to highlight and show you them in a moment. And thorough and accurate use of specialist language. I'm going to highlight that in green in my essay. So then these are the mark schemes for each particular question. So World Council of Churches, ecumenical movement, liberation theology and response of the Catholic Church, and kerygma, C.H. Dodd, and does the kerygmata have value today? And there are also questions on ordination of women and the filioque controversy. Of all of those, I don't think any of them have been asked again on a real paper, and so I think this sample paper is worth looking at. So there is a mark scheme here for the kerygmata still has value for Christians today. So you could have a look at this either by pausing this video or by going, probably better, to go to the Eduqas website and perhaps use this to put together a part B and come up with a thesis statement. Okay. So because that question's there, we're going to look at this question, which is, that's the wrong question, this question, which is the speeches and acts do not have historical value. So, as always, I'm starting with my thesis statement, and that has two functions. One, it's going to help me link back to the question to show that I'm thoroughly addressing the question. And two, it's going to enable me to introduce my view. I'm going to evaluate in line with that view in each paragraph. And that helps me show that I have got sustained and clear views. So the question is, the speeches and acts do not have historical value, and it would say evaluate this statement. And so I have got this essay will argue that the speeches made in Acts by St. Peter do have some historical value. Really, that should say Peter and Paul. Remember, I do these under time conditions with no notes, so there is going to be the odd glitch here and there. And then I give my reasoning, and that is that we can have some certainty that they reflect the proclamations. I've used that word deliberately because that's what kerygma means, made by the first disciples even if there's been some editing choices or redactions, I've used that word deliberately, made by Luke. Okay, so the line I'm taking is, they might not be word for word true, but they do have historical value. So my first argument is going to be the fact that many ancient historians, there was, almost an accepted practice that you could just make up a speech and then assign that speech to someone that you admired. And often the words that you assigned to them weren't even words that they would have said. And so that then questions the historical value of the speeches. That does not match my thesis statement, and so I'm going to counter it. Okay, and you can see some nice evaluation stroke analysis wording going on there. So I'm saying, however, the idea that Luke just completely made up the speeches is just not credible. Nice evaluation language there. We know that Luke was known to Paul, and I'm going to have to support that. I could have spoken about the journeys they made together, but I forgot, and I probably didn't have time. And that Paul held him in high regard, and this is my source of wisdom. In one of his letters, and I've forgotten which one, and it doesn't really matter, he calls Luke his beloved physician. And so would Luke really be making up speeches and putting them in the name of someone he had regular contact with, and it looks like they held each other in high regard? My next criticism of the speeches having historical value comes from the dating. So the Book of Acts is widely, so not everybody thinks this, but widely thought to have come from 80 CE. And so, 40 to 50 years after the date of the events of the speeches. And so then I'm going to back that up. And we know from source criticism, that's a school of thought, that Luke uses Mark as a source, both for Luke the Gospel and, so then Acts probably as well. And then I'm doing my linking back to the statement. This gap causes people to question the historical value of the Book of Acts, particularly when you compare them with St. Paul, because his letters are much earlier, or thought to be much earlier. In addition, Luke was thought to be a Gentile, and again I've got sources of wisdom to back this up. So St. Paul, in his letter to the Colossians, he lists people that he holds in high regard, and he lists a group of people who have all been circumcised, and Luke is not listed in that group. He's listed separately, and so it suggests he's not circumcised and therefore is not Jewish. He uses the phrase circumcised ones. In addition, if you go to university and you read the Gospels in Greek, as I had to do, you start with Mark's Gospel because it's really, really simple Greek, and Luke is much more complex. And so many scholars again suggest that's the evidence that Luke had a Gentile rather than a Jewish background. Then to add, so I'm building the evidence that Luke was not at the speeches, he wasn't a first-hand eyewitness. It's unlikely that someone who was Gentile would have been in Jerusalem at the time of Pentecost, which is a big Jewish festival, to hear the speeches. I've then got a little comment. It's a bit of a throwaway one, this one, but I was trying to get in another scholar. So Robert Grant questions basic facts in the speeches. So, for example, Peter claims, according to Grant, in Acts, it says that Peter made himself heard to thousands of people. So that's the source of wisdom. I have then challenged that. So again, nice evaluation language. However, this is not a convincing criticism because actually it doesn't say they all heard Peter. It says, this is my source of wisdom, that thousands of people were baptized as a result of Peter's speech. And so maybe they didn't all hear, maybe word just spread. And then I'm going to counter the view that Luke was not there, and so, how could he have known what's going on? We know from the birth stories so that's my source of wisdom, that Luke sees himself as a historian. He talks about the fact that he's interviewing eyewitnesses. I didn't include that, but he includes lots of historical details like the name of the Roman governor and so on. So history seems to be important to him. I mention a little bit later in this paragraph that C.H. Dodd calls Luke a careful, considered historian. That's a sort of a rough quote, so it would count as a source of wisdom. In addition, not everybody agrees that Acts is a very late book, and their evidence for this, there are various things, but the one that I've remembered is that Luke doesn't mention the death of Paul or James, and those events happened in the late 60s. And, would Luke have not mentioned the death of Paul? That he's got, Acts ends with Paul being in prison. And so, therefore, you could argue that speeches in Acts were recorded or written down within 30 years. And so there would have been plenty of people who could have said, you've made that up, it's not right. And so Luke's a historian and written within the lifetime of the people who made the speeches, and therefore it's accurate. And again, I've made my linking statement there. And so they must have historical value. Next paragraph, a further criticism of the speeches in Acts. That would have been better phrased. A further criticism of the historical value of the speeches in Acts is that Peter and Paul sound remarkably familiar. To the point it suggests that their speeches have been manipulated to sound familiar, and their speeches all follow this same pattern: a call to attention, a quote from the Old Testament, a proclamation about the life of Jesus, something about Jesus being the Messiah, and a call to repent and be baptized. If you look at Acts 2, you can see that structure there. In addition, this is my evidence again, Paul in Acts sounds very different to Paul in his own letters. And so again, that suggests that Luke has, at the least, very heavily manipulated that material. There are very few people who question the reliability of Paul's letters. And so then I'll bring in my next scholar, which is Bauer, and he suggests that perhaps there was a split in the first Christians of those that followed Peter and those that followed Paul. And so the letters of Acts are an attempt to kind of cover up this division. And so the letters in Acts are very heavily doctored by the later church in the 2nd century to make it look like there's this history of unity. And to support this, we know, nice analysis and evaluation phrase, we know that theology is important to Luke. And we know that from the redactions, nice key word there, that he makes to his birth story. He's very deliberately trying to make a point that Jesus has come for the Gentiles and the oppressed. And so he makes, redactions, he edits his story to make that point. And therefore, should we be overly surprised if he's done that to the speeches in Acts as well? And to build the evidence, there's then further evidence of later redactions or editing to the speeches in Acts. So Paul, in a later speech, uses the word saint, and that just isn't a word that would have been used in the 1st century. That reflects later church development. There's also, however, I'm then going to counter that so that it fits my view, and I'm going to say that editing a document isn't making it up. So there's still historical value there. And also, there is a slight difference in tone between Luke's Gospel and the letters of Acts. So in the speeches in Acts, very reliant on Old Testament prophecies, much less so in the Gospel of Luke. So that suggests that Luke is not completely having free will over what he's written. He is remaining faithful to the original speeches. And so then I have got my conclusion, which mirrors my thesis statement. So to conclude, the speeches in Acts do not have to be word for word true to have historical value. And then I've made a nice link at the end with Bultmann where I say, but actually this isn't what is most important about the speeches.